Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, social media world. Oh my God, has it been some time since I have come and shown you my face? I hope you are all doing really well. It is the last day of the week, and I hope you're looking forward to the weekend. Let me know where you are joining in from. Anybody who is live, feel free to say hello. Otherwise, hashtag replay. Okay, Alhamdulillah, today I wanted to talk to you about quite an important topic, and it is the desperate need of having validation and attention from your spouse. Now, I thought, how can I make this beneficial for you and you can take part in it and understand it more clearly as well? And I thought, I know, let's do an exercise. So, I'm going to give you a scenario and I want you to reflect and think of the answer once I give you the scenario. You have to answer the question that I'm going to give you. So you might need a pen and paper if this scenario applies to you. Now, just to say, the answer isn't actually as obvious as you might think it is. So it will require like deep reflection and deep thinking because a lot of people actually don't get this right. So I want you to think very deeply because it's not the most obvious thing. If I gave you an example, a scenario of two people, yes, so there's two people and they're both married, yeah? Okay. And one of them is a little bit hungry. That person hasn't eaten all day. They had to rush to work. They didn't have really any time to have breakfast and they didn't have anything to eat at lunch either. So maybe had a couple of minutes and grabbed a bite here and there, but it wasn't really proper food. Okay. And so now it's about 3 o'clock and they're just really, really hungry. Okay. So they haven't had much. So they missed breakfast. They had a bit of a late lunch, but very little. So they're pretty hungry, you know, as one person will call that the hungry person. Now, the second person is actually starving. And I don't mean starving like they missed breakfast or lunch or just missed a meal, but they are physically actually starving. They are they basically they're in the middle of a famine. They don't have any proper food. They haven't ate properly for weeks. It's not a day. And they're really starving. And you have a cheesecake, strawberry cheesecake. Yeah, so it's a very fancy cheesecake, right? And or whatever cheesecake you fancy. Imagine that. And you're going to hand this piece of cheesecake to both these people. Yeah, there's a hungry person and there's an actually starving, famished individual. Now, here's my question: who's going to enjoy the cheesecake? That's the question I want you to do right now or take a moment to answer. And think deeply, which person is going to enjoy it more? Which one is starving or worthy? So now that you got a chance to think about that and maybe write down your answer, let's discuss the answers. So, a lot of people, probably the majority of people, will say, I think that the starving, famished person is going to enjoy it more. Think when we're fasting, subhanAllah. When me and you are fasting, we can't wait at the end of the day to open our fast, right? We're hungry. But that's actually wrong. If you think about it deeply, when a person's starving, yeah, and I'm not talking about just missing lunch, I'm talking about a person who hasn't had a proper meal in weeks, they couldn't care less about what it is, whether it's a cheesecake or not. They couldn't care less about how buttery the crust is, the quality of the cheesecake. It's just food. And even if you gave them a toast or a plain piece of bread, they would have enjoyed it as much because they're starving. It's food. It's not about the great flavors and the various textures and the creaminess. But the first one, the one who's just a little hungry, they're not completely desperate for food. And so they can enjoy it more because you know why? Because just a few hours ago they had food and they're a little hungry. Now the person can say, you know what, this is a really nice cheesecake. the one who wasn't that hungry. I really liked the caramel in it, and the crust is just amazing. So, what's the point of the scenario? Here's the point. Ironically, and this is why I'm saying it's ironic, because most people think it would be the starving person. But ironically, the less desperate you are for something, the more you can enjoy it when you get it. And that's the point of this scenario. When it comes to love, for example, when a person's, let's talk about this with, now apply it to love when a person is famished, meaning they are absolutely desperate. They are like a couple of things that are going to happen. Number one, they're more likely going to accept a piece of cheesecake that isn't very good quality. Let's be real about that. They're going to accept things that are not good quality. And that's because it's just food, right? Any kind of food will suffice. Now, what does that have to do with relationships and love? When a person, for example, yeah, and I hear this from a lot of sisters, they put in this situation when they hit the age of 30, 35, 40, even more, 45, yeah, whatever. There's a lot of pressure put on them, specifically by families, that why aren't you still married? You're getting so old. You know that it's this age or that age. And what happens with that when a person gets to a situation where they just need to get married, just need to tick it off, it's a tick box exercise, that unfortunately they become more willing to compromise on the quality of the person they marry, on the quality of a cheesecake. So, for example, some of these women, they'll be pressured to just accept anyone. And they'll be like, oh, well, this guy breeds, yeah, or this girl breeds, yeah, well, but they don't pray. You know what? It's okay, because then people start justifying it, and they start settling. And when you start settling, it's much, much easier. It's much more like you're more likely to settle if you're in a situation of desperation. And this is really important. Yeah. So it actually becomes really dangerous to be in a situation where you're famished. And when I say famished, it's a metaphor, like metaphorically famished. Because what I'm talking about being in a situation where you're either emotionally famished or there because of external pressure, because your parents have made you, because your clock is ticking, because you need to have children. Yeah, subhanAllah, because you want to be around a spouse, you miss the emotional part of it, subhanAllah. So there's that external pressure, and you are desperate. Yeah, and you're desperate essentially, and you're more willing to reduce your standards. And again, that person who hasn't had a proper meal in weeks isn't going to care if the cheesecake isn't made well. It's just food, right? To them, it's just food. Now, even more so, and the other problem is that when you're famished internally, you're emotionally empty. That person, internally, they're not full. And if they are, if you're empty inside and you're absolutely desperate for something, then you're more likely to take that piece of food, even if it's not good quality. It may even have a bit of mold on it. You don't know, subhanAllah. But guess what? If someone doesn't have any other food and they're absolutely starving, they're going to eat it, even if it has a little. And unfortunately, this is what we see, is that when a person is absolutely in need and is desperate emotionally for whatever other reason it might be a reason that I haven't mentioned, they will put up with things that are not good for them. Example, abuse. If somebody's mistreating you, if someone's treating you in a way that's below what your standard of what you deserve, you know, you're going to be more likely to accept that because you have a desperation. There's a desperate need, or as we said before, it's an unhealthy type of dependency or attachment. And that puts you in a situation, subhanAllah, where you become more vulnerable and you become weaker, in a sense that because you're in need, you're willing to compromise on your standards, you're willing to accept less than what you actually deserve. And that is a big problem, subhanAllah. And that comes from being in a state of desperation. So what's the solution? The solution is you never go to the people, or you never go to the creation empty. What that means is you're empty because you're inside a situation When you're empty, you're desperate, and you will accept anything below your standard. And even in psychology, if when we go on Hajj and Umrah, yeah, and there's always, when we go on Hajj and Umrah, there's always that row at the back of people in Makkah, Medina, where there's a lot of beggars, yeah. And have you ever been to Umrah or Makkah, Medina, and you see beggars? And have you ever witnessed a beggar begging from another beggar? Yeah, have you seen two beggars asking each other for money? It doesn't happen, does it? So a beggar's never going to ask from another beggar. A beggar's going to ask from someone who they believe is rich. Yeah. So why is that? There's a couple reasons. Because how there's and how we view beggars, there's also a reason in that, subhanallah. But I'll get to the first one. The second lesson is no one likes a beggar. And human beings are repelled by beggars. Likewise, your spouse. Yeah. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yeah, He loves beggars and He encourages us to beg and ask Him. So, what happens when you come to the creation? Yeah, it repels them. Similarly, all of us are beggars, all of us are poor. Allah says it in the Quran that He is the one, that Allah is rich and we are poor. So, we are all in need, and only Allah is actually the source. Yeah, and Allah tells us that you're poor. Yeah, and He's the one who's rich. So when we're going empty and desperate to the creation, it's like a beggar begging from another beggar, and it doesn't make any sense because everyone's poor. So why would you ask somebody for something when you're all poor anyway? We're all poor beggars. Subhanallah, and Allah is the only one who's truly rich. And so a beggar only begs from the one who's rich. He only begs from the king. And so it's very, very important to have this emotional perspective, or even a relationship perspective, to not beg the creation, because the creation is also a beggar. And every single person is poor, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is rich. It's going to repel you. It doesn't, people are not attracted to beggars. In fact, we're repelled. So when you come to the creation empty and you beg them, not only do you come back empty handed, which is the sad reality, yeah, because you're a beggar begging from a beggar, but also you actually repel them. Yeah. And what does that mean in practical life? Well, I'm sure you all have relationships, yeah, and with friends and family, and certain relationships, you'll know a person who feels a little bit needy. Yeah, they're always needy. What you find is that when you think about your relationships, you tend to be repelled from the needy ones. Yeah, and in fact, there tends to be a lot more conflict with that person or friend or family member, that individual who's more dependent emotionally on you, because they're constantly begging, right? And there's always a reason why you didn't do enough, or something was wrong, or you didn't respond. That person thinks you didn't respond fast enough, or you didn't have enough emotionally in your response, or maybe something like that, whatever it happens to be. But the idea is that neediness, when taken to the creation, actually is quite harmful. So, what's the solution? The solution is to go to the creation ready. Yeah, and that's an important point. We're beggars. It's our nature that we are in need of Allah. Yeah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. We're not self sufficient. We're not created to be self sufficient. We are created to be in need and to ask and to beg. But we have to be careful that we're putting that need onto Allah alone, and requesting and begging from Him alone. So if you go to Allah to fill you, there's a deep concept. You're going to be filled emotionally, filled spiritually and psychologically, and you're going to become full. You're going to be a person who's going to be full when you go to Allah. But when you go to the creation, subhanallah, you're in a position. So if you're already full from what Allah has given you, you can go to the creation generous. And this is really key. It gets to the heart of the difference between true love and false or unhealthy attachments. True love is a person it is people who are already full internally, and now they're in a position to give love. See, if a person is rich, they're in a position to give, right? They're full. They're in a position to be generous. And when something is based on need, desperation, false attachments, unhealthy attachments, you're coming from a place of lack. You're coming from a place of emptiness. Yeah. And when you do that, when you come from that emptiness and lack and starvation, you're in a position to take. And that's why that type of dynamic is unhealthy, because it's just based on give me, give me, give me, give me, give me. I need, I need, I need, I need, I need. It becomes a sense of really just take and nothing to give. And that's not necessarily because you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, but because you have nothing to give. So you're actually empty, and therefore your hands are empty and you have nothing to give. So all you do is take. And so that kind of brings me to wrap up, because oftentimes when we start to talk about these concepts of, false attachment versus true love, people might think, well, that's a bit heartless, that's being a bit hard hearted. But in fact, when you have a relationship that's based on being full and not being in a state of need, not only does that become healthier, that relationship becomes healthier, but it also becomes a relationship of giving rather than just receiving. And that becomes more healthy and stable. A relationship based on both parties giving rather than that desperation all the time. So let me know, what did you take away from this? What are your thoughts? How do you feel about somebody who's constantly asking you, constantly begging you? How do you feel about, have you ever played that dynamic in a marriage? Subhanallah. And often we don't know how to do it, but you know what? Wallahi, the first step is that you have to have a really strong connection with Allah, and you have to make effort actively to make that connection stronger. Once you make that connection really strong, you're in a position of generosity, subhanallah. You don't need to always run to that person or that spouse or this person to want this or want that. And that's a fantastic solution. And if you try that for a month, subhanallah, wholeheartedly, you will see that this need for love and validation, you should direct it towards your creator. How many opportunities do we get, subhanallah, in the month of Ramadan, at the third part of the night, during the day, doing lots of different things, being good to people, that we can build our bond with Allah. So that's very, very important. So let me know. Jazakallah khair for all of you that have tuned in. I can't actually see who's live because they've changed the setting on the thing. Normally the names would show up, so I can't actually see your names. But let me know, what is your takeaway from that? What do you think about that? How do you approach your need for love? And I hope this exercise was useful for you, inshallah. Anyway, over and out. Have a lovely Friday and weekend. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.